Hi Year 4, it's Mr. Smith here. I hope you're really well. It's really nice to be talking to you again. This half term, we are going to be doing some RE, which I'm going to be teaching to you. And as you can see from the screen, the RE that we're going to be looking at is what does the Muslim community in the UK look like? So, Muslim is a word for a follower of the religion of Islam. And hopefully, this is something that you've come across before, whether that's in school or just in your local community. But a Muslim is someone who follows the religion of Islam. And what we're saying is, what does that community of people who follow that religion, what does it look like in the UK? Where do those communities exist? Where do they worship? What kind of activities are they involved in? So we're going to start looking at the sort of nuts and bolts of it in terms of where in the UK they actually live. But then we're going to look at some really interesting events that happen every year. Events that you've probably seen being out and about in London, places that you've been to that you're going to recognise. And we're going to just ask why the community does these things and why and how they're important. So, lesson one, where do Muslims live in the UK? Now, the answer to this, straight up, is just everywhere. There's probably not a city in the UK that doesn't have some sort of Muslim community living in it. But as with any community in the UK, they tend to be concentrated on a particular area. So, when I say that, what I mean is that if you take a street or a neighbourhood, for example, you might find that some of those streets and neighbourhoods have more Muslims living in them than others, and some areas of the UK have large numbers of Muslims all living together in one space. And we're going to look at what some of those are. Now, hopefully, you've got a copy of the RE booklet for this half term. What does the Muslim community in the UK look like? And we're going to be filling in the first page of that today, lesson one. So, this is a map, obviously. This is a map. This is a map of England. I mean, Wales and Scotland and Ireland are on there, but the data that we're looking at has only come from England. Before I do anything, I would like you to just take a look at this map and see if you can work out, using the key and using the different colours, what the map is showing us. Right, so you might have guessed it is showing us the amount or the proportion of Muslim people living in each area. So on the right hand side, let me just get my pointer up. On the right hand side, this is a key, and the key starts with very, very light green if it's 1% of people, so 1 in 100 people. And then it goes up to very dark green if it's 20%. So 20% means that if you had 100 people living on a street, about 20 of those would be Muslim. So let's have a look at where some of these green or dark green areas are, because that's going to help us to identify where some of the biggest Muslim communities are in the UK. They tend to be in big cities, as you can probably see. So we've got, starting close to home, in London, and this probably doesn't surprise you. London has a large Muslim community, mostly focused in East London, but we'll look at that in a moment. Luton's a town in Bedfordshire that is very, very famous for having a very large Muslim community. Bristol, somewhere I used to live, we're going to look at an event that happens in Bristol every year with the Muslim community. Birmingham, which is the second biggest city in England, that is a city with a large Muslim community. Leicester, Leicester is amazing. They have such good takeaway food in Leicester. Really good chai as well, which is a type of spiced tea. Very nice. I like Leicester. Bradford, and Rochdale in Yorkshire. No, it's in Lancashire. Don't get those two mixed up. So Rochdale, Bradford, Leicester, Birmingham, Luton, Bristol and London. And what you're going to do, your first activity in your booklet, is you're going to use this slide to draw your own version of this map. So you can see it's got the labels on there. You just need to make sure that you're labeling them correctly, so that you'll be able to write in whenever the Muslim community in Britain is focused mainly on, as it says on the screen, in big cities such as, and then you're going to say which cities are listed there. Okay, here's another map. Similar, but on a different, what's called a different scale. So instead of looking at the whole of the whole of England, we focused in on one city, and that city, as you can tell, because it's got the River Thames running through the middle of it here, is London. And here we are, well, we're not at the moment, unfortunately, but here we normally are, Charles Dickens Primary School in Southwark. And again, the darker green, the higher the proportion of Muslims. So actually the scale here is different, because the darkest green doesn't mean 20%, it means 50%. And 50% is a half, okay? So 50% of people living in some of these communities in East London in particular, but also out here a little bit in West London, 50% of those, half of those are Muslims. So let's have a look at some of the places on this map. There we go. And you can see that the biggest mosques in London. So what's a mosque? Yeah, it's a place of worship for a Muslim person. So the biggest mosques in London are located, unsurprisingly, where you find the highest levels of Muslims. So there aren't very big mosques out here in Hillingdon, or over here in Havering, or down here in Sutton or Kingston. Instead, probably the biggest mosque in London is here in Regent's Park, and the second biggest mosque is here in Whitechapel, and then Hounslow as well. And again, you are going to label the map in your booklet to reflect the communities there. Right, let's talk about what we mean when we say the word community. Oh, do you notice that? Well, we've talked about that. Okay, this half term in RE, we are going to be looking at some of these Muslim communities and what they do together. But what do we actually mean when we say the word community? Because what you're going to do is you are going to define what a community is. So you're going to say a community is ... Before we do that, let's talk about it a little bit. So is it just a group of people? I don't know. No, not really. I think a community has to have something that joins it together, and hopefully that's what you've been saying as well. A group of people, like, you wouldn't say that your carriage on the tube was a community. You wouldn't necessarily say that getting on an aeroplane makes you a community. But when you all live in the same place, or you all have the same identity, so the same race or religion or nationality, that does kind of bring you together as a community. So this is what I thought, and I've covered it up with the box, which is very clever. But a community is a group of people who live together and usually have a shared identity, like religious belief or nationality. And there doesn't have to be a shared identity. I feel like I'm in a community with the people who live in my village, but we're not all the same race or religion, but we all live here. So I would like to hear you perhaps come up with an even better definition for community than the one I've got there, because yeah, that's an okay definition, but I'm sure you can come up with something better. Great, so it's been lovely talking to you, as always, Year 4, one of my favourite year groups. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I will see you next week with more RE. Bye bye.